America's foreign aid isn't just about handing out dollars, it's about power, survival, and whether the United States can still be trusted as a global leader. For decades, humanitarian relief and development programs weren't just charity, they were the backbone of alliances, the quiet glue holding together relationships in every corner of the world. But today, that foundation is crumbling. Billions in contracts have been canceled without warning. Entire NGO networks have been dismissed, and allies who once counted on America are now asking if Washington's word is worth anything at all.
Secretary Rubio, look forward to two sessions together today. This afternoon, you'll be in front of the Appropriations Subcommittee. And I think there's going to be some themes across both of these. First, I think we all agree that China poses our single greatest geopolitical threat and that we have no choice but to deter China across the board and to outcompete China. Senator Ricketts and I just traveled to the Philippines and Taiwan and saw directly the challenges that we face there and regionally. And you've recently had some significant successes, the DRC, Rwanda, peace transition, the avoidance of escalation in India and Pakistan, the opening towards Syria. But I also frankly think that there's been a real lack of coordination and some serious harm to our standing in the world with some of the countries that we have worked most closely with over decades. The DOGE-driven, abrupt, and largely illegal cancellation of billions of dollars of contracts for humanitarian relief and aid, and the disrespect and the dismissal of thousands of AID staff and our NGO partners stands in sharp contrast to the state reorganization process you just presented on in your following. You've submitted plans and proposals. We're having a conversation. You're going to send a congressional notification. We're going to have a hearing. That's the way that the reforming of USAID could have and should have happened. And so I just at the outset had to say, as someone who spent 15 years traveling the world, visiting both our partners and allies, looking at independent or semi-independent agencies like the MCC and the DFC and their role, and visiting NGO partners and the USAID, I reject the broad characterization of them by Elon Musk and DOGE as criminals who were wasting taxpayer money. You've heard across all of us support for PEPFAR, concern about humanitarian relief, and the vision that this is a key strategic asset for us. It's my hope that we'll work together to actually make real a more effective, focused, and sustainable foreign aid component to what STAID does, and sustaining organizations that we help build together, like the MCC, the DFC, and the Global Fragility Act. So let me turn to this for a moment. My colleague, Senator Shaheen, made reference to places in the world where the CCP and the PRC have stepped forward. I agree, they're never going to deliver humanitarian aid the way we used to, and with the breadth, depth, and effectiveness that we have. But I also think they're taking advantage of the opening to say that we're not reliable, that our decades-long partnerships can't be sustained and extended, and to question our motivations. So I think we need to step out quickly to avoid creating a big hole in our credibility globally. Let me just start on a few questions with Ukraine. The previous administration worked closely with our partners and allies in Europe on sanctions to tighten them, to close loopholes, to extend designations. Are you continuing to do that?
Work with our allies?
To tighten the sanctions?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, the Europeans have their own set of sanctions, and we've coordinated with them very closely. In fact, the president had a call with at least 6 leaders from Europe yesterday. I had meetings with what we call the Quint that include Italy, France, the UK, the Germans, the French. So we are in constant contact with them on the work that they're doing. And they're proceeding along their own route. And in fact, in our conversations in the past with the Russians, we made clear to them that the Europeans and ultimately will have to be at the table because they have their own set of sanctions that they're imposing. So the answer to your question is we have worked very closely with them. The president understands fully the options he has available to him, some of which are represented in the bill before the Senate.
In the bill before the Senate that Senator Graham and others have led and that I co-sponsor, I think we have an opportunity to put more pressure on Russia and to push Putin to get to the table and to agree to a just and enduring peace. Do you support that sanctions bill? And do you think we should continue to arm Ukraine and to strengthen the sanctions against Ukraine in order to create the conditions for a real negotiation.
Yeah, look, it may come to that point. If in fact it is clear that the Russians are not interested in a peace deal and they just want to keep fighting a war, it may very well come to that point. The president has made that in the past. Our belief, the president's belief, is he believes that right now if you start threatening sanctions, the Russians will stop talking. And there's value in us being able to talk to them and drive them to get to the table. Like, we'll see. Look, they have to do this. No one's claiming that this is a guarantee.
President Zelensky reversed himself, showed up, was ready and willing to negotiate. And Putin, I think, my view, continues to play for time.
Well, so
I hope that we can work together to put more pressure on Putin to get to the table and to resolve this. The other thing that I see clearly, and I think many of my colleagues do, is that what happens in Ukraine sets the table for what happens in the Indo-Pacific. That there's an increasing coordination between the Russians, the Iranians, the DPRK, and the PRC. Do you see that as well, Mr. Secretary?
Well, we remind our European allies every day that were it not for China, Russia would not be able to sustain this. And they're fully aware of that. And obviously, we all understand the presence of the North Koreans and the Iranian role in this as well. But by the same token, I would say there's a flip side to that, and that is every minute we spend, every dollar we spend on this conflict in Europe is distracting both our focus and our resources away from a potential for a much more serious, a much more cataclysmic confrontation in the Indo-Pacific. So the answer is yes, they are related, but they're related both ways. They're related on the one hand by the precedent that it could set, but they're also related by the fact that every minute that we spend on this conflict that cannot be won by military means, every resource that's expended into it is money and time that's not being spent on preventing a much more serious confrontation from a global perspective in the Indo-Pacific.
You made the point earlier that, in your view, we did not coordinate well enough between countries where we for decades had done humanitarian aid, disaster relief, public health work, and countries that ally with China in terms of resource mining and processing. One of the countries we visited was the Philippines. The Philippines is the most disaster-prone country on earth. They have more.
Meanwhile, Beijing is watching closely, stepping into the gaps with its own aid and investments, projecting consistency where America projects chaos. What was once a tool of stability is now a symbol of disarray. And the cost of that disarray isn't measured only in failed projects, it's measured in lost credibility, shifting loyalties, and the risk of surrendering the future to our greatest rival. When lawmakers talk about America's single greatest geopolitical threat, the answer is almost unanimous: China. Unlike past rivals, Beijing isn't challenging Washington on just one front. It's pushing across every dimension: economic, military, technological, and diplomatic. In the Indo-Pacific, Chinese ships test the waters of territorial disputes. In Africa, Beijing bankrolls massive infrastructure projects. And in the Middle East, it positions itself as a new power broker, stepping in where U.S. influence has faltered. What makes this more alarming is that China's strategy is not chaotic, it's deliberate. Every loan, every aid package, every development deal is tied to a larger plan, locking in long-term influence and undermining America's global leadership. By contrast, U.S. aid programs have increasingly looked inconsistent, fragmented, and sometimes even reckless. Billions of dollars in humanitarian contracts have been canceled abruptly. NGO partners with decades of trust built on the ground have been dismissed without explanation. Allies left in confusion see a superpower that looks uncertain about its own strategy. And in geopolitics, perception is everything. While China projects focus and discipline, America risks projecting doubt and disorder. That imbalance doesn't just weaken foreign aid, it erodes the very credibility that has long been Washington's strongest asset. Billions of dollars in aid contracts were suddenly canceled, and thousands of experienced NGO staff were dismissed almost overnight. For countries that had relied on U.S. humanitarian assistance for decades, the move didn't just look abrupt, it looked reckless. Partners on the ground who had built trust with local communities were left blindsided, and the damage to America's reputation was immediate. What made this worse was timing. China was already expanding its reach, using aid and infrastructure projects to entrench itself in regions where Washington had once been dominant. As U.S. programs collapsed without warning, Beijing stepped in with its own offers, paving roads, financing ports, and handing out development deals that looked reliable compared to America's sudden retreat. Allies began to ask a dangerous question: if America can walk away from decades of partnership overnight, what promises will it truly keep in the future? That kind of doubt is hard to erase once it takes root. It transforms foreign aid from a symbol of solidarity into a warning sign of inconsistency, and in global politics, inconsistency is fatal. Because while China tightens its grip with calculated patience, Washington risks being seen as erratic, losing credibility at the very moment it needs it most. The war in Ukraine has become more than just a regional crisis, it is now a test of America's ability to lead alongside its allies. From the beginning, European nations have imposed sweeping sanctions against Moscow, closing loopholes and tightening restrictions designed to squeeze Russia's economy. The United States has been at the center of this effort, coordinating measures and maintaining constant communication with partners in France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. These sanctions are not just about punishment, they are about proving that democratic alliances still have the strength to hold firm when challenged. But the challenge grows more complex each day. Russia shows no real interest in negotiating an end to the conflict, and its persistence is backed by covert support from Iran, North Korea, and most significantly, China. For Washington, the dilemma is clear: double down on sanctions and military support, or risk sending the signal that America's resolve can be worn down over time. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine's borders. If the U.S. falters in this moment, the message to adversaries is unmistakable: America's commitments are flexible, and its promises negotiable. That perception alone could embolden rivals and weaken alliances that took decades to build. What happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Europe, it directly shapes the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Every dollar poured into Ukraine, every shipment of weapons, and every diplomatic meeting absorbs U.S. attention at a time when Beijing is quietly maneuvering for dominance in Asia. The danger is not just the cost of the war itself, but the opportunity cost: resources stretched thin, priorities blurred, and focus divided. Russia's refusal to negotiate drags the conflict on indefinitely, and in the meantime, it has drawn closer to China, Iran, and North Korea. This alignment creates a growing bloc of authoritarian powers determined to test America's limits. While Ukraine bleeds, Beijing studies the playbook, watching how long Washington can sustain its commitments and how reliable its alliances truly are. The uncomfortable truth is that an endless European war could become a strategic trap. It drains resources, consumes political capital, and distracts from the theater where the stakes are far higher: the Indo-Pacific. There, China is building military bases, expanding economic leverage, and preparing to challenge U.S. influence head-on. Unless Washington recalibrates, it risks being caught flat-footed, overcommitted in one arena, while losing the initiative in the region that will define the century. Few places illustrate the stakes of America's foreign aid strategy more clearly than the Philippines. This island nation is one of Washington's oldest treaty allies, positioned at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, and directly in the path of Beijing's growing ambitions. It is also the most disaster-prone country on Earth, hit year after year by typhoons, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. For decades, U.S. aid programs provided not only humanitarian relief, but also a lifeline of trust, stability, and partnership. That trust was shaken when a wave of U.S. development and disaster relief programs was suddenly canceled. Local communities that had come to depend on reliable support were left reeling, while NGOs that had built networks of credibility were sidelined. Into this vacuum stepped China, ready with offers of infrastructure investment and development financing, portraying itself as the steady hand in a storm of uncertainty. For Washington, the loss goes beyond missed aid projects. It strikes at the credibility of a relationship built over generations. If a treaty ally like the Philippines begins to question American reliability, others in the region will take note. In the contest for influence, hesitation and abrupt withdrawal aren't just tactical errors, they are openings for rivals eager to prove America is no longer dependable. If America is serious about reclaiming its credibility, the answer may lie not in dismantling aid but in reshaping it through institutions designed for strategic impact. Two of the most important are the Millennium Challenge Corporation (MCC) and the Development Finance Corporation (DFC). Both were created as alternatives to traditional foreign aid programs, structured to emphasize accountability, transparency, and results rather than endless bureaucracy. The DFC, for example, invests in infrastructure, energy, and development projects that create stability while countering the debt trap diplomacy often associated with Beijing's loans. The MCC, meanwhile, works through long-term compacts with countries that meet standards of good governance and reform, rewarding progress while building trust. Together, these institutions represent a vision of aid not as charity but as partnership rooted in shared values. But today both are under review, with fears that budget cuts and restructuring could weaken them instead of strengthening them. Reform done carelessly risks hollowing out tools that are uniquely positioned to push back against China's expanding influence. If reformed wisely, however, MCC and DFC could transform U.S. assistance into a pillar of credibility, proving to allies that America not only shows up, but shows up with consistency, purpose, and long-term commitment. The danger is not just in where America invests, but in how quickly it is tearing down the very institutions built to carry out its strategy. Across multiple agencies, staff have been suspended or dismissed, programs dissolved, and decades of expertise pushed aside under the banner of reform. What was meant to be fine-tuning is starting to look like dismantling, and the consequences stretch far beyond paperwork. When aid agencies lose their capacity, they don't just lose jobs. They lose institutional memory, relationships on the ground, and the ability to respond to crises with credibility. Each gap left behind becomes an opportunity for Beijing to expand its influence. Infrastructure projects, media networks, even humanitarian missions are quickly filled by China's reach when Washington steps back. The message to allies is unmistakable: America may talk about partnership, but it is not always there when it counts. Short-term political gains at home risk becoming long-term strategic setbacks abroad. Great power competition is not decided only by missiles or markets, it is decided by trust. If allies see U.S. institutions hollowed out and unreliable, they will hedge their bets elsewhere. And in this race, every vacuum America creates is a gift to its rivals. America's foreign aid is more than goodwill, it is leverage, credibility, and the quiet force that shapes alliances in a world defined by competition. When aid is scattered, cut, or mishandled, the cost is not just wasted dollars, it is trust lost, influence surrendered, and ground ceded to rivals who never miss a chance to fill the gaps. If Washington cannot show consistency, others will step forward, and not with values that promote freedom or stability. The choice is simple: lead with focus, or watch leadership slip away. What do you think? Can America still be trusted abroad? Let us know below.